Okay, let's get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Martin Donaldson. I'm on the Adult Ministries Committee, and we have a wonderful program for the session this morning. Our two speakers are um, Dr. Megan McDermott-Murphy and Dr. James Murphy. And they are both clinical psychologists at the University of Memphis. And the topic for today is understanding addictive behavior, a public health response to the opioid epidemic. So they're both assisting graduate students in their research, and they're seeing patients, I would assume, in the clinics. And they're conducting research that is funded by the National Institutes of Health. So if each of you would just kind of explain a little bit about your background before you go into the topic, I would most appreciate that. Thank you. And let's start with Jim.
Sure. Thank you, Martin, for the introduction and for the invitation. I'm happy to be here today. So I'm a clinical psychologist. I study substance use and misuse. I'm most interested in understanding the development of substance use problems among young adults, which is the age range where rates of alcohol and drug misuse are heaviest, and also a critical age range where you can alter problematic trajectories of use. And so much of my research has focused on very brief, what we call motivational interventions that can reduce alcohol and drug use among college students and other young adults, and really try to prevent the development of more severe addiction. So I've done a lot of clinical trials that have led to approaches that can reduce heavy drinking and drug use, and also understand more about what are the risk factors that lead to more developmentally persistent drug and alcohol misuse versus developmentally limited use that tends to decrease throughout the 20s.
Hi, I'm Megan McDevitt-Murphy, and I really appreciate the invitation to speak with you all today. I also am a clinical psychologist. Jim and I both got our PhDs at Auburn University, and we came to Memphis in 2006 after having done a postdoctoral fellowship at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. And my research has focused primarily on post-traumatic stress disorder and the intersection of post-traumatic stress disorder and substance use disorders. And I think across both of our research programs, we're interested in understanding the factors that contribute to substance misuse, both within the individual, but also factors in the environment. And we're interested in developing ways of helping people that are but primarily through the use of different forms of talk therapy or psychosocial therapies, sometimes very brief, as Jim was saying. And these often involve helping people to develop different habits and different ways of approaching their environment and of coping with the stresses that come their way. So I think we will move into our presentation. And our guess in developing this was that each of you has probably been touched by the addiction epidemic in some way in your life, whether it's something that you yourself have struggled with, someone in your family, or just being in a community where you're aware of friends and neighbors or other folks who are, whose lives maybe have been devastated by addiction. So this is something that touches all of us. The word epidemic has been used now for many years. And has been most recently applied to opioids in particular. And that is certainly an area of major concern. It's where we've seen an increase in deaths. But the opioid epidemic is really part of a larger addiction epidemic. And so a lot of what we talk about today is going to be relevant to both specifically opioids, but also more broadly addiction. So, wow, all right. Okay, I gotta use the arrow. There we go. So just as an overview, we want to touch on what causes addiction, and just as a coming attraction, it's complicated. That will not be a simple answer, but we also want to talk about the biopsychosocial model of addiction, And then we thought it would be important to talk a little bit about the intersection of the opioid epidemic or the addiction epidemic and COVID-19 pandemic. So what are the implications there? How are those two things coming together? And then we wanted to end on a note of, what can we do? And thinking about we very broadly, we as individuals and we as a society. So we hope that you offer something, you'll learn something, and also we are more than happy to answer questions, and we'll try to kind of keep an eye out for someone trying to get our attention or wave their hand or whatever. Okay, so as I mentioned, I think we're very used to hearing the phrase the opioid epidemic, but we want to encourage you to think more broadly about the addiction epidemic, which include alcohol, opioids, and other substances of abuse. Oops, did not mean to advance that. Okay, this slide shows a graph of the rise in deaths due to illicit drugs over time. So this slide does not include alcohol, bless you. And the most striking thing is the shape of the lines. Okay, so across the bottom, the x-axis, we have time with more recent years toward the right. And then across the y-axis or the vertical axis, we have the number of deaths. The numbers themselves are less important. I don't want you to focus on that, but I want you to focus on the slope or the shape of these lines. And what you can see, especially with synthetic opioids, this turquoise line is a very steep increase over the last 5 or so years. The data that are reflected in this slide ended in 2017, but we have every reason to believe that even with the most recent data, these numbers have continued to increase. But you'll also notice that there's an increase in each of the other categories other than methadone. Methadone is not typically a drug that people abuse. It is a medication that is an opioid, but it's used in the treatment of opioid use disorder. So it's not one that people typically would buy on the street. But methamphetamine, cocaine, other forms of synthetic opioids, or other forms of opioids, and then heroin, each of these shows an increasing slope over the last few years. But nothing is near the slope of this synthetic opioids. So this is a problem. It's been a problem for a long time, but it seems to be increasingly acute. That slide did not depict alcohol. Alcohol is another really important part of the addiction epidemic or the public health problem associated with substances. And some people have also placed drug-related deaths, alcohol-related deaths, and suicide together and described those three categories as deaths of despair. And I want to point out that suicide has also been increasing in the US, and substance use often plays a role in suicide. So many people who die by suicide had a substance use disorder, and many people who didn't, they did use substances in a risky way. And among people who die by suicide, there is often evidence of acute substance use, alcohol or opioids, most commonly at the time of death. So these are not really truly different categories, I would say. We could think about suicide and deaths by alcohol and drugs all reflecting some similar processes. And all of these categories are increasing over time. So we put in the title that we want to kind of talk about this from a public health approach. And some of you may be wondering what we meant by that. And I just want to talk a little bit about that, and it relates to what's on this slide related to language. But I think we're used to thinking about substance use disorders in a very individual way. And historically, addiction or alcoholism have been described as, failings of an individual, right? A lack of, self-control or some issue residing within the individual. And those terms, addict, alcoholic, they're very categorical, and they're very sort of, they reflect a dichotomy. You either are in that category or you're not. And there's a lot of people who actually wonder to themselves, gosh, I wonder if I'm an alcoholic. I see in myself this, this, and this, I'm drinking in a way that is causing me difficulties, but yet I don't drink every day. And so people sort of wonder sometimes, what do those terms mean? And from a public health perspective, we would say those terms can sometimes cause difficulties. So within the recovery community, the terms addict and alcoholic are important aspects of people's identity. They are embraced, those terms are used frequently, but sometimes in other contexts, they can lead to confusion. And from a public health perspective, we want to encourage you to think about a continuum of problems or a continuum of impairment. And so not everybody would fall into the category that we all might agree defines an alcoholic or now someone with alcohol dependence. But yet there are a lot of other people who may have difficulties or their substance use interferes with their life. And those are important targets from a public health perspective, even though they may not be the most severe end of the spectrum. So related to that, there are some different terminology that you'll hear in different contexts. In our field in psychology, and I think there's a movement sort of more broadly, maybe in the medical field, to use what's called person-first language. So rather than describing someone as an addict, or even you could think about this in a medical field, a diabetic, you would describe them as a person with a certain condition. So we might use the phrase a person with alcohol use disorder, or a person with a pattern of hazardous drinking or hazardous drug use. And one of the reasons that's important is, depending on the context, it's very easy for people to kind of forget about the human associated with what they're talking about, right? And those terms can be dehumanizing. And this has been a struggle through the history of addiction and substance use disorders, that people, there's a lot of stigma. There's a lot of sort of, people who are struggling with addiction can often feel like they're being held at arm's length. And so we want to just to let you know why we're going to use the terms that we're using, and also to think about how the terms might translate to the way that we think about individuals struggling with addiction. Some of the terms listed on this slide are not relevant. We're not going to be getting into them in the talk today, but person-first language is important. Another aspect of a public health approach is this idea of a continuum, as I mentioned. So the triangle that you see moving from left to right, it increases in severity. So we have people, and the language on this slide deals with alcohol, but you might have people who are either not drinking or drinking at very low risk on the left, all the way up to very severe on the right. The width of the triangle is meant to reflect the relative numbers of people. So there's a lot more people who drink in a way that is at no risk or low risk than there are at the severe end. There's also a lot of people who are at that at-risk, mild, or moderate levels of severity. Lots of people in those three categories compared to this very severe end. This is another reason why we don't want to get too locked into thinking about the most severe forms of addiction, and why we want to think about all the different ways that substance use can take a toll on the public health. And one of the things I forgot to mention on the graph, but when we think about the deaths due to alcohol or drug use, there's different ways people have quantified it, but as you all know, there are times where a person with a substance use disorder may result in another person's death, right? So they're contributing through impaired driving or some other accident to deaths of others. So from a public health perspective, we want to be thinking more broadly about the effects broadly in our society, and also describing patterns that may result in harm that are not at the severe end. Yeah.
Sorry, I just want to add something here, because it connects to treatment and to how to help people, which we'll talk about more in the second half. But I think one of the biggest problems, barriers to treating and preventing the whole range of substance use disorders, is the societal misperception that either you have a quote unquote addiction or you don't, right? Either you're an alcoholic or you don't. And so in fact, the vast majority of people that have difficulties with alcohol or other drugs are in that kind of mild to moderate range, where they're not using every single day, they're not losing their job and their family, they're not destitute, but alcohol or cannabis or cocaine or whatever it might be is causing some impact on their life. But they don't look like the people in the movies, or they don't look like that stereotype of the person with a more severe substance use disorder. They're not ready for a lifelong commitment to abstinence, and so they don't seek any treatment, right? Over the last 30 years, there's been huge advances in providing mostly behavioral treatments for people with more, mild to moderate levels of alcohol or drug misuse. And so that's where this public health model, and just really, really appreciating that the range of severity from the person who drinks, a couple extra glasses of wine too often, and it results in some level of tension or impact in their life. There are treatments for those people, just like there are treatments for people who are very severe, but that doesn't involve going away to rehab, or it doesn't involve necessarily 12-step groups, right? So just wanted to sort of plant that seed about the importance of recognizing the whole range of substance use severity, and how when we don't do that, we really prevent a lot of people from getting the types of treatment services that could benefit them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And all right, I'm just going to click on this because the chat. Okay. And I also that reminded me that I wanted to say, if everyone's able to access the chat, you can feel free to put questions there that we will hopefully see and answer or try. Okay, this is another slide just depicting the continuum of substance use. The prior slide talked about alcohol in particular, and I just wanted to illustrate that it's relevant to drug use as well. And one really important part of the opioid epidemic is that the port of entry for many people to a pattern of substance misuse, so difficulty managing their use, is when a physician or healthcare provider gives them an opioid to manage pain. So many people, opioids are used for the management of pain. There's increasing evidence out there about the conditions under which it can be helpful and when it may not be helpful. It is often prescribed in situations where it really was not going to be optimally helpful. And it doesn't take long. It's really a matter of, I believe, 2 weeks, if your body's getting a steady state of opioids, for your body to start to adapt to that and to develop some degree of dependence. So I think an important part of a public health approach to addiction is for providers and patients understanding the conditions under which opioids may be really beneficial for pain, and the conditions under which it may increase their risk for a pattern of hazardous use or dependence. And that's just something that the worlds of pain management and addiction have not always really talked to each other in a way that I think is optimally protective of patients. I also want to point out that this is what Jim was saying. There are, well, it was like on the other slide, there are many people who use alcohol, and I would also include cannabis in this, in a way that is non-problematic. So we're not here to pathologize every instance of substance use. But then, as you look down the continuum, you have people who are using in a way that's problematic. So it's interfering with their life in some important ways. Some people are using in a way that's harmful. They may be having health impacts of their substance use. And then in our field, and in like the journal articles, like in clinical psychology related to this, the most common term that's used diagnostically is substance use disorder. And I just wanted to point out that that's roughly equivalent to how we talk about addiction. So that's a category that's describing really the more severe. There's a range even within that, but there are a lot of people who may be using in a way that's problematic that would not even meet the criteria for a substance use disorder. All right, so I'm going to shift, I think, is this your,
yeah.
I'm going to shift to the causes briefly. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, all right, so this is where it gets complicated, right? So as psychologists, we are very used to explaining that, like all behaviors, substance use behavior is multiply determined, right? And so one of the things that we've learned as a field over the last 25 years is that substance use behavior is not really in an entirely different category of behavior than anything else, right? So everything we do is determined by the ongoing interaction of our biology and our environment, right? And there's also a burgeoning field called epigenetics, which suggests that even the environments of our parents and our grandparents influence the way, influence gene expression in offspring, right? So the nature-nurture question is incredibly complicated, right? Our biology is impacted by our environment, right? And everything we do is a very complicated interaction of those things. And you could see here a number of the biological factors at the top, right? And biology encompasses everything from our genes, but also to our biological state at any one given point in time, which can be influenced by things like how we slept last night, right? What our diet is like, what our level of physical activity is, right? And so our behaviors could very directly influence our biology, right? Many of us have seen the movie Super Size Me, right? If you haven't, it's a great movie. It's a great illustration. This is really quickly a person who eats McDonald's every day for a month, and every time he eats McDonald's, he supersizes his meal so that it's, this 2,000 calorie meal. And what we see in that is that diet results in profound changes in his mood. It results in significant relationship impairment, right? And so we could see that that's a behavior that is influencing his biology. It's also an environment, right? The availability of really cheap, calorie-dense food, that environment, that high-risk fast food environment is also influencing his biology, right? So similar with substance use disorders, all of these things are influences, right? It's complicated to explain. So with any one person, you can't say, oh, this person developed a substance use disorder because of their family history. That may be one factor, but if there was not a lot of drugs available in their environment, they may never have developed a substance use problem, right? For example, rates of alcohol misuse in the state of Utah are significantly lower than in other states because alcohol is less available there, right? So these are really complicated interactions. From a treatment perspective, you could look to manipulate or change or enhance all of these various factors, and they will have potentially positive effects on helping people change substance use. So for example, if you're able to improve family circumstances, which is a part of the social and environmental circle, if you improve somebody's family functioning, that will make it more likely that they will be able to reduce their substance use, right? If you're able to reduce somebody's level of physiological arousal through something like mindfulness or through spending more time in nature, that will reduce their level of arousal. They'll have lower stress. They'll have less desire to use a substance, right? The most effective treatments try to target all of these things, right? But different things work for different people, and all of these different domains are contributing to the problem and also could be part of interventions. Okay, all right, so these are an example of social and environmental factors. Family history is certainly one risk factor, but it's not an overwhelming risk factor, right? Current availability, so the opiate epidemic, it's a little too simple at this point to lay the blame on overprescribing of opiates, but certainly that triggered the epidemic, right? The idea that in this country, we had rates of opiate prescriptions that were multiple times as high as they were in other developed countries. And consequently, we have an opiate epidemic that's multiple times as large as it is in every other developed country. Clearly, the environment had an impact there in terms of increasing that. This is a key that the availability of alternatives. I want to talk about in the context of this study, just to kind of illustrate. Okay, so one of the interesting things about understanding why people use drugs is that the very same drugs that people misuse, like nicotine, alcohol, opiates, if you give those same drugs to animals in a lab setting, they will use those drugs as well, meaning they will press a lever in order to get access to those drugs, right? Those drugs are reinforcing, meaning they produce some sort of desirable subjective effect, whether it's making you feel a little bit better, whether it's making you feel a little bit less anxious, whether it's making you feel a little less bored, whether it's allowing you to socialize in a way that's a little more enjoyable. The very same drugs that people misuse, animals will misuse. And therefore, you could do things that would be unethical to do with people. For example, you could expose animals to drugs and see if they decide to take them, right? We couldn't do that to people, right? That would be unethical. So you could learn a lot about drugs, about risk factors for drugs from animal studies. And there was a series of really important studies called the rat park studies that occurred in the late 70s and early 80s. They've been replicated in different forms over the last 3 decades. And the essential finding is that if you take a rat, the rat on the left, which is in a solitary, very deprived environment, there's nothing to do. This poor rat is in there, is bored. It has one option: press a lever and get access to a stimulant drug, right, like cocaine. It will press that lever thousands of times to get a drug dose. If you take those genetically identical rats and instead of randomly assigning it to the deprived environment, you assign it to this enriched environment on the right, which is called Rat Park. This is like the penthouse for rats. They've got running wheels, they've got litter mates to play with, they've got other food options. They will actually use very little drugs, right? They will not develop much of a preference for drugs at all, right? Even if you take a rat that grew up in this deprived environment and then you put it in the enriched environment, it will reduce its drug use significantly, right? Which is really compelling because the early models of addiction said that once you're addicted, it's this biological process, right? And the only cure for that is to sort of, remove yourself from the drug, to kind of put yourself in an environment where the drug's not available. Well, this suggests that you could enrich the environment with alternatives, and that will also suppress drug use, both in terms of initiation and also for treatment. Well, what does reward deprivation mean for humans? What are the situations that lead humans to have a paucity of rewarding alternatives, and that therefore make the relative value of drugs greater, right? The first thing that comes to mind is poverty, right? And there's good evidence to support that although addiction strikes people at every socioeconomic strata, folks who are in deprived environments have greater rates of substance misuse. Discrimination is also a risk factor, right? So when you're discriminated against based on your race, ethnicity, religious preferences, sexuality, that is, you're not experiencing the same level of reward as other people. You don't have the same opportunities, and therefore it makes drugs more valuable, right? And there's lots of other conditions, mental health conditions in particular. There's an overwhelmingly greater level of drug and alcohol misuse among people with mental health conditions, right? Those people also have less access to reward, right? Also transitions, life events, losing a spouse, losing a job, all those things that rob us of natural, healthy ways to experience reward will increase risk for substance use. Obviously, we're in a pandemic right now that is having an unprecedented impact on our ability to experience reward through sort of what we call natural reward, through things like socializing, doing work, going to the theater, whatever it is that we like to do to experience reward. Many of those venues are no longer sort of accessible to us. And alcohol is, right? You could order, there's apps that will have alcohol at your door in an hour, right? And so that source of reward is now really easy and accessible, whereas we have to, there are many other types of rewards that are not, right? So I think one of the things that we've learned over the last 20 years is that addiction it's a brain disease in the sense that taking drugs impacts your brain, right? And part of the reasons that we desire drugs is because we have brain regions that are very sensitive to the effects of those drugs, right? When we use drugs, it activates the same brain regions that are activated by evolutionarily salient things like sex and exercise and social activity, right? So it's certainly a brain disease, right? But it's also a disease of the environment, right? And I think this idea of addiction as a disease of the environment leaves a lot more room for public health approaches. It also, as loved ones of people with substance use disorders, it gives us a pathway to try to help folks, right? That in addition to, for people with severe addiction, taking medication that might help with craving, that might provide another way of experiencing reward, we can work to enrich environments so that drugs are not the only source of reward in the person's environment. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about COVID as it relates to the addiction epidemic.
Great, and some of this, ties right back to some of the stuff that Jim was just talking about, but I was thinking about just this whole notion of addiction as a brain disease, and I think that's probably a phrase that a lot of you have heard before, and I think that thinking of addiction as a disease, and particularly as one that affects our brain, has been one important way of reducing the stigma associated with substance use disorders. But I think it's important to kind of keep in mind that it's not a disease in the way that a virus operates or a bacteria operates. It is multiply determined, as Jim was saying. The other thing to think about is that those brain regions that are affected by, let's say, opioids, you've probably heard about the way that neurotransmitters work. And dopamine is a key neurotransmitter related to addiction. And what you may not realize is that a lot of other positive, constructive activities also result in the release of dopamine. And there are other neurotransmitters too, but even just to focus on that one, a lot of those other activities, they take a little bit of time, they take planning, they take effort, but ultimately you get that hit of dopamine. And you could think about something like an opioid or a drug of abuse as almost like virtual reality for your brain. So it's giving your brain this dose of that chemical that's associated with healthy, constructive, positive events without any of the benefits, right? So if being social or exercising results in a release of dopamine, that helps us keep doing those things, right? We're like, that felt good. Man, going for a run didn't sound like a great idea, but I knew it was good for me. And when I get done, yeah, I feel great. Well, that's how it feels when you get a hit of dopamine, even without the effort. And so it's one of the risks here. And if our brain wasn't set up to respond to dopamine, we wouldn't have issues with drug abuse, right? So I think the virtual reality metaphor is sometimes helpful. It's like it's giving your brain this thing that it thinks is real and that it thinks is important, but it's in the absence of those parts that are really important to us as humans in terms of our connections to other people and doing the activities that are really healthy for us. So thinking about the way that COVID-19 has affected probably all of your lives, certainly it's true for us, and the ways that, what we know about addiction, it's very easy to think about how these two epidemics intersecting could be really catastrophic. And it was interesting, Jim and I are doing a specific training program for students in our department to give them training in treating substance use disorders, especially, this is a program that's funded by HRSA, which is part of the federal government, and they want to prepare the next, wave of healthcare providers to be ready to deal with, the current public health crisis of addiction. And so we were looking for articles recently, and I noticed in a recent journal that were across different journals, there were several that used the term collision to describe the intersection of COVID-19 and addiction. And it's such to me, a violent term. And yet I think it's very accurate. I mean, there's really a lot of potentially catastrophic effects. So thinking about what we need for our health and our mental health, a lot of that comes down to our connections with other people, being part of a community, having people available to listen to us, to help us problem solve issues, to lend a hand when we need, some material help. All of those things are much more difficult to access in the context of COVID-19. So for most of us, if we can work at home, we're working at home, we're really limiting how much we're interacting with other people. We're not going to church services. Just all of the different ways that we would interact with people have been reduced. And of course, that's in the interest of keeping us all alive and safe from the virus. But for some people, that will result in such a loss of important social connection that it can increase the risk for things like depression, anxiety, even suicidal thoughts, as well as the risk factors associated with hazardous substance use. So I think I've sort of mentioned some of what's on the slide. The other thing I want to mention is a lot of 12-step meetings, thankfully, are still accessible. They've moved online. Well, so they're accessible to people who have an internet connection, who have the technology, who are in an environment where they can connect. For some people, they're not going to be able to connect to their recovery communities that may have been really important to them. There's also something that's just not quite the same about doing all of our social activity through Zoom, through online. I mean, it's awesome, it's amazing. I cannot imagine experiencing the pandemic without these tools. But on the other hand, there's something about not actually being in the same room as people who you really rely on for support. It's also more difficult to access care. And part of that comes from hesitation on the part of patients or clients that going out anywhere, that there could be some risk of infection is scary. And I think we all sort of assume that healthcare facilities are probably places where there could be more risk. Thankfully, most of them are really doing everything they can to mitigate risk, but it's another reason that a person may be hesitant to seek care or may not be able to access care. Also, there's just some places are not able, some treatment facilities are not able to offer the same level of care that they did before. And some people, due to losing a job or losing other financial support, are no longer have the resources to seek addiction-related care. So there's a lot of different ways that the COVID-19 pandemic, really, I think the effects of the social distancing and the fear of infection are really amplified for people with addiction or substance use disorders. And I also want to say that many of the same risk factors that put people at risk for a worse outcome of COVID-19 are similar to the risk factors for a more chronic course of addiction. So poverty, even just thinking about a person in a city like Memphis, if you have transportation or not, that's a big factor in your health outcomes. If you have to get on a bus to get anywhere and you're then at risk of contracting the virus, that's got implications for your health. And if you are relying on public transportation to get to your health care, your addiction care, that's a huge cost. It's not as easy, right? It's you're at the mercy of the bus schedule and whatever other risks or costs come along with that. And just like we have seen that the toll of COVID-19 is different depending on people's race, their socioeconomic status, and a lot of other sort of psychosocial stressors. A lot of that is also true for addiction, and it relates to access to care, and also, deep-seated systemic racism or biases on the part of people within the healthcare, machine, if you will. This is there was a recent study that actually polled people who are dealing with addiction themselves about the ways that the COVID-19 pandemic has affected their ability to manage their addiction. That was sort of how it was phrased. And I thought it was interesting that they broke it down by age and by gender, but really for most of these groups, across different phases of adulthood and across genders, about a third of people, a quarter to a third, are saying that they have had more difficulty managing their addiction in the context of COVID-19. And then this slide gets at some of the specific areas where COVID-19 has caused additional concern or difficulty. So being unemployed, uncertain about their work situation, and also isolation. So the two questions that got at isolation from friends or family, you can see that's endorsed by almost 80% of respondents. And then uncertainty about the future. That was also one of the most frequently reported areas of concern. And I think we can all relate to that. I mean, there's a lot going on right now that is deeply unsettling and leads to a lot of concern about, our own health and ability to maintain safety from the virus. So we wanted to close by talking a bit about what can we do. And as I said before, I think we could think about we at different levels, we as individuals, and then we as part of a larger public health system.
So I think the first thing is treatment is effective, right? So substance use treatments work. That doesn't mean that they work right away or the first time, right? There's lots of relapse, especially for people with more severe substance use disorders and for people with fewer resources. I mean, there are many people who have, let's say, mild to moderate problems with drinking. Somebody who, binge drinks on weekends, but they have relatively stable functioning overall, and they'll just make a decision one day, I'm just going to stop doing this, right? And that person may not need any treatment at all, right? That's one of the things that is interesting about addiction treatment, is that most people who recover from a substance use disorder do not participate in treatment, right? They actually recover on their own using resources in their community, meaning their church or their family, or they'll just have an aha moment where they'll say, this is it, I'm just going to give this up, right? So that's actually the norm, right? But for people who are more severe, there's a huge benefit from treatment. There's also a huge benefit for treatment for people who are not very severe, but who might want to talk with a counselor about how to manage their drinking a little bit better, right? Like, how to develop the skills and strategies to really stick with the drinking limit, right? To have only 1 or 2 glasses of wine instead of 3 or 4, right? And that could actually have a big health impact, especially as people age, or especially if people are in risky situations, like they're driving, right? Or they're in other high risk situations. The difference between a really bad health outcome could be determined by whether you had 5 drinks versus 2 drinks, right? That's the difference between a DUI versus not, or that's the difference between a blackout and having, getting into a fight, getting arrested, having a really bad thing happen to you. And there are treatments that, can be as brief as 1 or 2 counseling sessions. There's even online web-based programs that provide people with personalized feedback about how their drinking compares to other people's drinking and what their specific risk factors are. This is a lot of the work that we do with what we call brief interventions. So those treatments help. Like, you could have 1 web-based session or 1 or 2 in-person sessions, and that could be associated with sort of lasting reductions in drinking, where your drinking or your drug use goes from a risky level to a much safer level, right? And that's okay, right? Everybody doesn't need total abstinence, right? People who are more severe and more chronic do best with abstinence. But for many people, what we call harm reduction, right? Going from a risky to a less risky level is a completely appropriate goal. So again, we have to appreciate there's a continuum of substance use severity, and there's a continuum of intervention approaches, right, that are sort of suited to the various levels of problems.
Okay, let me just chime in there too, because with opioids in particular, but also with some other substances, there's increasing evidence that medication-assisted therapy is really helpful, particularly for those at the more severe end of the spectrum who have struggled with maintaining abstinence or striving for moderation or reducing use. without medication. So medication-assisted therapies or medication-assisted treatments, that's a category that includes several different medications, but most recently for opioids, there's actually a drug that is, it's in the brain. It occupies some of the same receptor sites that opioids do, but it does so in a way that is safe and reduces craving for opioids and does not have the effect on one's cognition and sort of alertness. So people can use the drug. So Suboxone is one example. So people would be prescribed Suboxone. It is an opioid derivative, I guess. I was maybe what you.
Yeah, so it's an opioid agonist and antagonist. So if you take it, it gives you a little bit of that pain-reducing opioid effect, but it also occupies the receptor site for other opiates, so that if you take Suboxone and then you try to take heroin, the heroin won't have any effect because the Suboxone is occupying the receptor site. So that's why it's a really effective medication. And as Megan said, for people with severe opioid use disorder, medication is by far the most effective intervention approach, especially when combined with counseling and other forms of support.
Yeah, so people who are successfully treated on this will describe it as a total game changer. And so I think that's provided a lot of hope for people who really struggle to just cut themselves off from drug use.
And so, also we have to understand the reasons people use drugs, right? So with opiates, people use opiates largely to deal with pain, right? Thankfully, there are a lot of other ways to deal with pain, right? Opioids are incredibly fast acting and sort of powerful for acute pain, but there's actually better ways of dealing with chronic pain, right? And opiates over time lose their efficacy to address chronic pain, and of course have lots of side effects. So helping people develop other ways of dealing with pain is an important part of this. Naloxone training, right? This is a drug that will reverse the effects of an opiate overdose. That's really important. Even as just, caring citizens, you could get naloxone training in a number of hospitals and other places in this community. Many people carry naloxone so that if you see somebody who's overdosing, you can give them naloxone and it can be life-saving, right? So that's an important public health approach as well. So again, there's a whole continuum of treatment, right? That includes aftercare. For people with mild to moderate substance use problems, they often don't need any treatment, or if they do need treatment, which again can be very beneficial, and that might occur in the context of a few visits with a counselor, a psychologist, a social worker, or through conversations with friends or clergy or family, they may not need a lot of aftercare. People with more severe problems really benefit from aftercare. And aftercare often involves 12-step or other self-help groups. So mutual help groups, right? Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous. There are a number of different self-help options, many of which are also online right now. Those are incredibly helpful. They're not formal treatment, meaning if you have somebody who has a very severe disorder, let's say they're using opiates, daily, and there's a risk of withdrawal if they stop using. The first place they need to go is to get medical assistance, right? They need to get detox, they need to get prescribed a medication like Suboxone. But then engaging with 12-step groups can be incredibly important. And there's been a lot of careful research that has addressed the question of how these groups work, right? And the clear answer is that they work by providing people with social support and people to socialize with who are not drug users, right? So one of the most challenging things about changing a severe substance use disorder is that you often have to give up a whole circle of friends who are also using substances, because if you stay around those people, you're likely to relapse. But to leave those people, you're leaving social support, right? And so AA and NA and other self-help groups are very effective, but they're effective because they enrich your social environment.
There was a question in the chat about a dependence versus addiction, and maybe this is a good place to address that.
So there's a lot of overlap between the idea of dependence and addiction, but there's also some unique distinctions, right? So, so dependence can be both physical and psychological. If you take a drug consistently for a long enough time, right, your body adapts to the presence of that drug, right? So if you're drinking alcohol every day, alcohol is a sedative. It activates the GABA, which is a sedative neurotransmitter. Your brain will react to that by producing less of that sedative neurotransmitter, right? Because if it didn't, when you drank all your alcohol, you would stop breathing because you'd have too much of that sedative neurotransmitter, and too much sedative will put you to sleep. If you have even a greater amount of sedative, you'll stop breathing, right? So your body, there's neuroadaptation to the presence of that drug. And so that will result in physical dependence, meaning if you pull that drug away, all of a sudden you stop drinking, your brain has less GABA or sedative neurotransmitter than it needs. And so then you won't be able to sleep, or you might even have a seizure, right? Because if you have zero sedative neurotransmitter, your body goes into a state of hyperarousal. So physical dependence happens whenever you're taking a drug for a long time. If you're prescribed an opiate, you may become physically dependent, right? Now, addiction is a broader cluster of behaviors, right, that involves using in a way that's harmful to you, right? So if you're taking opiates as prescribed, you may become physically dependent, but you might not have meet criteria for addiction because you're not doing it in a way that's harmful, right? Now, obviously, if you're physically dependent, then that's a huge risk factor for addiction, but it is important to make that distinction that those could be separate things, right? And dependence could also be psychological. Many drugs like marijuana or cannabis, there's some physical dependence, right? But it's a lot more psychological. Same thing, with alcohol, there's certainly physical dependence with alcohol, but for many people, it's more of the psychological dependence, like, oh, wait, I can't go to this party without drinking because what am I going to do with myself, right? Or I can't have my evening meal without a glass of wine, right? And it's not that it's a physical dependence, but it's just this belief, this sense of needing it, right? That's more psychological dependence. I'm not sure who does that help clarify that question? Martin. Okay, awesome. All right. And then have you seen behavioral changes in your students as a result of COVID? Anecdotally, we interact more with graduate students than undergrads, just given our roles, but everybody is, a little less happy, a little more stressed. And then the unrest, over police brutality and over, racial injustice compounds that. There's some sense of hope around that this is a time for change. But absolutely, I think people are more withdrawn. People realize that humans are social animals, and when you take a lot of that away, there's no way it's not going to impact our moods. And if our moods are lower or we're more anxious because we're worried about COVID, then alcohol and other drugs are more appealing, right? Because they're more appealing when your mood is low or when you're anxious. So absolutely.
All right, so does anybody have any questions that they would like to pose to our presenters this morning? You can either chat, or Daniel can unlock people that could ask live.
Yeah, and you should be able to unmute yourselves as well. There's a lot of you that aren't on video, so I can't see you if you wave, but you should be able to unmute if you have a question, or you can just type it into the group chat.
Right, I really want to thank you for a wonderful presentation this morning. You're obviously very enthusiastic about what you do, and you're very knowledgeable about what you do. And so in behalf of Idlewild, I really appreciate that you took the time out of your busy schedule to spend some time with us.
We really appreciate the invitation. Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for tuning in today.
Okay, good.
And if you have any follow-up questions, you could find us, or we have University of Memphis emails. So just go to the U of M website, type our names in, feel free to shoot us an email. And thanks to everybody for their attendance. And Martin, thank you for the invitation. And Daniel.
It was wonderful to host such knowledgeable people.
I'll type our email addresses into
Oh,
the
good.
chat.
Next week, we have Shamichael Hallman will be talking about the Cossett Library renovation.
There are a couple chat questions or comments. Are they just you with?
We our email addresses are in there, and then there's a couple of notes of thanks. So.
Okay, all right. Well, very good. I think everyone's asked what they want to ask, and I appreciate your presence here this morning. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Very good.